My name is Dwayne Benjamin, and I'm currently the Vice Dean, Graduate Education in the Faculty of Arts and Science, and I'd like to welcome you here. The Malim Harding Visiting Lectureship in Political Science and Economics was endowed by C. Malim Harding in 1985. Since then, the Harding family have been strong supporters of the event, and we'd like to acknowledge our gratitude to Victor Harding. Malim Harding was an alumni of the former Department of Political Economy, and the intent of the visitorship is to invite distinguished scholars to share insights from political science or economics with a special focus on current issues of public policy. Today, we are very pleased to have Professor Jeffrey Smith, the Paul T. Heyne Chair in Economics, University of Wisconsin, as our Malim Harding visitor. Just some background. Now, when I started graduate school back in the mid-1980s, our more senior, soon-to-be graduate classmate, Robert Lalonde, published Evaluating the Econometric Evaluations of Training Programs with Experimental Data. While at the time I did not get the clever play on words, I did think it was a cool methodological paper, using real-world experimental data as a benchmark. How well did the fancy econometric procedures that we always use, how well did they work in yielding comparable results to what an experiment would yield? But training programs? Surely this was just a convenient illustrative data set of no particular independent interest. Little did I know how influential that paper would ultimately be, and moreover, the importance of training programs more generally, and in particular, the substantive economic and policy questions that they addressed, that that paper addressed. Econometric methodology, obviously something very important. The value of experiments as a means of evaluating policy. And a third insight from that paper was the limitations of government training programs to improve earnings of disadvantaged workers. I also learned that these were not just big programs quantitatively, but addressed a more fundamental set of questions concerning the links between public policy and the formation of human capital. How can you best help disadvantaged workers? It's into this area, the intersection of methodology, experimental evaluation, human capital, and education and public policy that Jeff Smith has made such fundamental contributions. Professor Smith received his PhD at the University of Chicago in 1996, where he began a fruitful partnership with Jim Heckman, addressing questions of the relative merits of experimental and non-experimental evaluation strategies, including the extent to which non-experimental data would be informative on policy questions. He started his academic career at the University of Western Ontario, where he began his long affiliation with the Canadian labor economics community, which is where I met him back in those days. And he was also connected to the Canadian public policy community more generally. Now, in the 20 years since his PhD, Professor Smith has published extensively on a wide range of topics: the evaluation of training, econometric methodology, post-secondary education, the assessment of education administration, and the role of evidence-based public policy more generally. He's also written countless reports for various governments in Canada and the United States. Indeed, if you're looking for a trivia teammate and are expecting any questions on the history of acronyms for Employment and Social Development Canada, Jeff is your ace in the hole. More substantively, his work is exemplary of the two-way relationship that can exist between research and public policy. Public policy informs his research, and his research influences public policy. Finally, in his spare time, Jeff has served on an astounding 97, going on 107, dissertation committees. These are PhD dissertation committees. He's truly an all-round scholar. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Smith to the University of Toronto.
Thank you very much for that delightful introduction. Bob Lalonde, Dwayne's colleague in graduate school, was actually on my dissertation committee at Chicago as well, and unfortunately passed on a couple weeks ago, sadly. But he was a very cool guy, and it really started this important literature. That's me. This is the first talk I'm giving as an employee of the University of Wisconsin, so that's kind of exciting too. I just started there on January 5th. My health insurance started today, you'll be glad to know. I like to start with gratitude. Thanks for the invitation to do this. I'm really honored, and I want to say thank you too to the Canadian economics community. Western Ontario was a great place to start my career. It was interesting to me, and I've been talking about this with a couple of people today, that there's sort of a Canadian labor economics community, and there's a US labor economics community, and there's a world economics community, and being at Western allowed me to kind of be in all three, and they were distinct and had distinct roles in my intellectual development. But they were all very valuable, and the Canadian labor economics community was then and has continued to be incredibly welcoming and incredibly fun to interact with. My 7 years in Canada also netted me a wonderful wife, whose parents are here in the front row, my wonderful in-laws. So I often tell people in the US, and I am not originally Canadian, I'm American, that there's a great value to spending some time somewhere else. You actually get a different perspective on the world. So anyway. You heard most of this from Dwayne. UWO, Purple and Proud, that was fun. So I will move on from there and mention a little bit more briefly. So this is going to be a talk in some ways more about evaluation policy than about the evaluation of the specific policies of active labor market programs, or ALMPs. This is going to be a lecture that is rich in acronyms, not just for HRDC/HRSDC/ESDC, but also more generally, this is a field that is rich in acronyms. So I like to distinguish between policy evaluation and evaluation policy, where I think of evaluation policy as a sort of broader structure that the government undertakes within which it decides how it's going to facilitate the evaluation of individual policies. And so evaluation policy takes the form of sort of designing the institutional arrangements that are going to govern program evaluations and designing the data collection that is going to allow program evaluations. And so I'm going to give kind of a general but not very technical talk about evaluating labor market programs and programs in general. And then I'm going to use the history of labor market program evaluation in Canada to sort of raise some interesting questions and to frame some interesting discussions of evaluation policy. So I have a long history with consulting on evaluations of active labor market programs in Canada. It was fun over the past couple weeks to go back and reread old memos and emails and things, and to be in touch with the people at what used to be Apt Associates of Canada, and then was Applied Research Consultants, and then was TNS Global. There's lots of name changing in Canada too. And to be in touch with the people at the federal government, actually, about this stuff. So my first experience was something called the SOMS, the Service Outcome Measurement System, in fall of 1996. And since that time, I was involved in the evaluations of numerous programs, highlights including a presentation to the Deputy Minister in April 2006. That's higher up the food chain than I've ever gotten in the US. And we had a famous conference in the Ottawa hotel that was hosting the G7 meetings at the same time. This was during the period when the G7 meetings were inciting riots. And so the hotel was surrounded by a chain link fence, and there were armed guards, and it was, that was entertaining. All right, broad outline. First, I'm going to tell you, in case you don't already know, what active labor market programs are, to give you a sense of the specific context. Then I'm going to talk about the evaluation problem and strategies for solving it. I'm going to sort of argue that active labor market programs are a nice place to think about this, partly because we have really good data, partly because we know that there is a real serious evaluation problem in this context. Then I'm going to give a short history of active labor market policy evaluation in Canada, and then I'm going to, as I mentioned, discuss some questions that are raised by that short history. What are active labor market programs? these are programs that are designed to improve employment and earning outcomes for the unemployed, typically. Most developed countries, most OECD countries, have programs like this. These countries tend to offer the same set of services. So there's been a little slippage in the line breaks, but I think you can see occupational skills training, so sitting in a classroom or perhaps sitting in a classroom and going to a firm and learning how to do some new occupational task, how to weld, how to use Microsoft Office, whatever. Subsidized employment or on-the-job training at private firms or sometimes at government agencies. So there the government's role is mainly to facilitate a match and to provide a subsidy to get a firm to take on a worker that they might not want to take on anyway. Self-employment assistance, to help people start small businesses. That can take the form of teaching them how to run a business, how to create a business plan. It can consist of a subsidy. And then the most common, by a long ways, are interventions related just to job search. So you teach people how to write a resume, you teach people how to behave in a job interview, how to present themselves well, and so on. And maybe you also provide them with some sort of carrot or stick to get them to search a little harder than they otherwise would do. So basically all the Central European and Northern European countries, all North American countries have programs that look like this. Australia has programs that look like this. The services are all about the same. They're organized kind of differently. Some of them are more centralized, some of them more decentralized. Some of them have a greater emphasis on caseworkers, right? So if you are unemployed in Germany or Austria or Switzerland, for example, your caseworker is a very important person in your life because in the systems in those countries, they have a lot of power over what happens to you when you're unemployed. They can basically force you, on pain of losing your benefits, to take a particular training program. US and Canada, a bit more gentle in this regard, actually. People have to self-select into the training typically, and they can quit when they like and so on and so forth. But there's a very common structure here, and as a result, we can learn, and I'll be referencing some papers later on from the literature in Europe about how to think about these programs. There's a whole bunch of questions you might ask if you were the boss of one of these programs at ESDC that you might ask about the programs, that you might want your economist evaluator or your political science evaluator or your sociology evaluator to try to answer. The most common one, and the one I'm going to focus on mostly here, although at the end I'm going to return to the question of what questions we should be focusing on in evaluating these programs. The one I will focus on here is just what's the effect of one intervention or any intervention relative to no intervention, right? So I want to think about, here's a person who came to our program and we trained them to be a welder. What would have happened to them in the alternative world where they didn't come to the program and learn how to be a welder, right? So they got to the door, perhaps, and the door was closed. And so they just went out and did what they would have done instead. That's what program evaluation literature calls the counterfactual. What would have happened otherwise? I'm told that philosophers don't like this use of the term counterfactual. I'm not quite sure why, but we will go with it today. Another question that you might be interested in is, think about that person who came and learned to be a welder. What if we had trained them to be some sort of office worker instead? Right? So that's a different kind of comparison. That's not a comparison between intervention and no intervention. It's a comparison between one intervention and another. The first question is going to be very relevant if we're thinking about getting rid of the program, right? If we wanted to do a cost-benefit analysis on the program as a whole, we would like to know what's the average impact, perhaps measured in dollar terms, compared to what's the average cost, right? The simplest possible cost-benefit analysis is going to say, once we've appropriately discounted those things to the present and so on, that we should keep a program whose average impacts exceed its average costs and we should discard other programs. The second question is more of interest if what we're up to is not thinking about whether to keep or trash the program, but what we're thinking about is how to design the system that allocates participants in the program to particular services, to job search assistance versus training, or a wage subsidy versus training, different types of training, right? That's more of an operational question, but that's a very interesting question too, and one that evaluators can and also have addressed. Another question related to this allocation theme is, How much power should the caseworker have over the choice of intervention? This is something that's actually been studied a little bit in the US, it's been studied a bit in Europe. That's a very fine-grained question about institutional design, but it's also a very important question. What time should the intervention take place relative to the beginning of an unemployment spell? So this is something that I've done a bit of work on, that the Europeans have done a bit of work on. There's been a trend over time towards trying to intervene with unemployed people earlier on in their spell of unemployment. And there's a literature that tries to think about optimal timing. You don't want to go too fast because you want to give people a chance to find a job on their own before you spend money on them. But you don't want them to linger in unemployed and become discouraged and have their skills atrophy before you get around to helping them. And so there's a literature that tries to kind of find the sweet spot in the middle there. The last question, and I'm not going to belabor this theme, although it's another thing that I have written on, what is the effect of the program on non-participants? Now, you will think for a minute and say, wait, why should the program affect non-participants? But there is a labor market, right? If I have my program and it's in some small or medium-sized place and I train 100 people to work at hairstyling, I have flooded the hairstylist market where I am. And that, you would say, the simplest economic model would say, is going to depress the prices of hairstyling, right? That is going to reduce the income of the pre-existing hairstylist in that city. That's an effect on non-participants. If I get people in my program all excited about getting a job so that they search harder, or I teach them how to write a resume and give a good interview so that they do better, then some people who in the world without the program would have gotten a particular job are going to find that that job is taken by somebody from the program because they gave a more impressive interview or had a more impressive resume. This part of the literature, and I'll call that the literature on the general equilibrium effects of active labor market programs, is very small. Too small, I would say. Having said that, I'm going to spend most of the rest of the lecture acting as if there are no general equilibrium effects, which is what the literature does. There's a general theme in economics sometimes which needs to be resisted, but isn't resisted as often as it should, which is the idea that anything that is hard to measure must equal zero. And students in particular like to think that. But I want to focus mainly on the first question. I want to try to convince you that answering the first question is hard. And the reason it's hard, remember, the first question is program versus no program, intervention versus no intervention. Eligible individuals in a kind of system like the one in the US and Canada, where it's not the caseworker bossing you around, but where you have free choice, right? You've lost your job, let's say, you start looking, you look for a while, at some point you say, well, this isn't going so well, maybe I need to go down to the Canada Employment Center and get some help, right? Who chooses to do that, and when they choose to do that, seems to depend a lot on variables that we don't ordinarily measure. Right? So there's a lot of selection on unobserved variables, if you will, of a couple particular sorts. The result of that there seems to be a lot of selection on things other than schooling and the kinds of things that show up in the usual data sets, is that if you simply compare the outcomes of participants to the outcomes of non-participants, even if you condition on a handful of usual suspects, you're going to get severely led astray in terms of what the answer is. I'm going to try to illustrate that for you using a graph, which I was unable to put into these slides myself, but I received assistance, and I appreciate that, and putting it in the slides. One of my skills that has atrophied from when I was younger is the skill of making elaborate slides. So this is data from the US, from the Job Training Partnership Act program. And they did an experimental evaluation of the Job Training Partnership Act program. This is around 1990. This is the big federal training program in the US, very much like what goes on in Canada now and what went on in Canada then. And it's nice, both because I have the data on my hard drive, because I used it in my dissertation, and because it has data at a monthly level. And we're going to come back to that theme of temporal coarseness of data later on in the talk. So I want you to focus here on the two lines at the bottom. And the middle line on the left-hand side, so the one that starts around 700. So those are dollars of earnings per month. On the horizontal axis, we have time periods in months. Month T is the month of random assignment in the experiment. Right? So the group that starts in the middle with the finely dotted line is the control group from the experiment. So these are individuals who were randomly assigned, right? So they decided to participate in the program. They wanted the Job Training Partnership Act. They went down to the office. They were determined to be eligible. And then the die was rolled, and it was not their good day. So they were randomized out of the program, so they were sent away. And they were not allowed to participate in the program for 18 months. What you see there in the, well, okay, that's the control group, so the finely dotted line. I want you to ignore the solid line. The upper line is a group called the eligible non-participants, or the ENPs. So these are people who were determined in a survey to be eligible for the Job Training Partnership Act in month T. Right? So we know the controls are eligible in month T. We know that the ENPs are eligible in month T. That is why I have aligned them in time at month T. The ENPs are in the same local labor markets as the controls. So in part of this experiment, and this is fallout from the Lon's job market paper, the Department of Labor in the US said, whoa, Bob has kind of convinced us that the standard non-experimental strategies that we've been using to evaluate these programs are rubbish. We can have another chat and another talk about whether that's the lesson they should have drawn, but that is the lesson that they drew. And so we're going to run an experiment. But then there was a response to Lalonde by Jim Heckman and Joe Hutz that came out in the Journal of the American Statistical Association. That's my committee, by the way. How lucky was I, Jim Heckman, Joe Hutz, and Bob Lalonde, that said, wait a minute, Bob's conclusions are too strong, that if you gather comparison group data and do a strict regime of specification testing, you can salvage non-experimental methods. And DOL was convinced by their argument, so they spent $5 million collecting the ENP data in $1990. So the ENPs are eligible non-participants. They could have gone into JTPA in month T, but they did not. They're in the same local labor markets. The dotted line is the controls. So I want to highlight two features of the differences between those two lines. The first feature is the so-called Ashenfelter dip. Right? So you can see that the mean earnings of the controls fall quite substantially from around $700 a month to around $300 a month in the 18-month period leading up to random assignment. So that's Ashenfelter's dip. It's named after a guy called Orley Ashenfelter, who was the chair of Bob Lalonde's dissertation committee. He first identified this phenomenon in a 1978 paper. It is an ecological phenomenon in the sense that essentially no individual workers experience this smooth earnings decline. Individual workers experience job loss. But if you average over the job losses, which are timed so that they increase in frequency relative as you get closer to month T, you get this smoothly declining aggregate figure. There is no corresponding dip for the eligible non-participants. So what does that tell you? That tells you that people are selecting into these programs based on transitory labor market shocks, right? They lose their job, or maybe they get cut back to part-time or something, right? Something happens in the labor market experience of the participants that leads them, perhaps with some lag of trying out the market, trying to search on their own, to try to participate in the program. We have selection on transitory shocks. There is also a persistent difference in means between the average of the ENPs and the average of the controls. So that is telling you that not only is there selection on transitory shocks, there's also selection on time invariant characteristics, right? There is a persistent difference between the people who show up at JTPA and the eligible people who don't. And there is a transitory difference between the people who show up to JTPA and the people who don't. This Ashenfelter dip phenomenon is, to the extent that anything is ubiquitous in labor economics, it's pretty ubiquitous. It shows up in lots of different programs, in lots of different countries, in lots of different times. And it makes sense if you think about why would you bother to go down to the government training center to try to get some training? Well, you've lost your job, the opportunity cost is low, maybe you have lost a job that's probably not coming back, so you think you need new skills. Lots of reasons to think that this is what the picture would look like if you wrote down a model. This is why the selection problem is tough, right? You've got selection on time invariant unobserved characteristics, and it's more than just the usual suspects. I'm not going to show you this, but just conditioning on years of schooling and age and standard demographics gets rid of some of the time invariant difference, but by no means all of it. There's more to it than that. There seem to be time invariant unobserved characteristics, or at least unobserved relative to the usual set of conditioning variables that you might find in the labor force survey. And you've got the selection on the shocks. And these are pretty big selection, right? It's a big shock. That's a big difference. Now, even in the JTPA data for adult women, the time invariant selection is less. So there is some heterogeneity across groups, across contexts, in the nature and extent of the selection. But there's a lot of selection here, right? That isn't always true. There are programs and policies where people select in apparently more or less at random. This is not that case, and that's part of what makes active labor market programs interesting to look at from the standpoint of evaluation methods. All right. So what do we do? No? Okay. I want to go through 4 of the standard strategies in a very quick way that one might use to try to deal with this problem of non-random selection. So we have non-random selection. We can't just compare the participants to the non-participants. We can't do that even conditional on a handful of usual suspect observed characteristics. What are we going to do instead? Well, one thing we could do that's become very fashionable in the last 20 years or so, particularly in development economics, is we could do a randomized control trial. We could do an experiment. So we can take would-be participants, right? And this is what they did in the JTPA case, and that was a big deal. It was the first major experimental evaluation of an ongoing program in the US. Take people who've shown up and been determined to be eligible, and then randomly exclude some people from the intervention. If we do that, right, this is the world of doctors. We can put on our lab coats, we're doing science, right? Then we can just compare the mean outcome of the treated units, the participants in the program, to the mean outcomes of the untreated units, the non-participants. If we have implemented random assignment correctly and modulo various criticisms of random assignment, a couple of which I will talk about, we have a compelling causal estimate of the effect of the program by doing this random assignment. And that's a nice thing. Now, it's actually in practice much more complicated than that. In the JTPA context, for example, 40% of the people in the control group went and got services that looked like JTPA services, but not from JTPA. Why does that happen? Well, in the US context, a lot of these services are provided by community colleges. And if you don't get the welding program paid for by JTPA, you can go down to the community college and pay for the welding program yourself. And there were actually instances in that experiment where there were classrooms that had students who were both treatment group members and control group members sitting in them. That complicates interpretation, as you might imagine. 40% of the people in the treatment group never enroll in JTPA. So there's a substantial amount of no-shows. That complicates interpretation as well. The literature worries in a kind of theoretical way about what's called randomization bias, right? Will the set of people who show up to a program be the same if they know they're going to be randomly excluded, potentially, as if they don't know that? We don't really know, but we worry about that. There are political issues with random assignment. There were newspaper articles I have in my files, sitting in a box in a storage locker at the moment, about how somebody at a local newspaper in one of the experimental sites wrote an article about how the government was treating the local residents like laboratory rats. You know, people who run programs are often people who would like to eventually run for other political offices. Having newspaper articles about how you're treating the locals as laboratory rats is not helpful in that aim. And so people don't like, you know, there's some bad politics sometimes that come with experiments. Nonetheless, they do happen sometimes. They happen more often in the US than Canada. And that's an issue that I want to return to at the end as well, about the relative dearth of random assignment evaluations in Canada. Strategy number 2, it's called instrumental variables. It has nothing to do with violins or tubas or anything like that. An instrumental variable is a variable that affects whether or not people participate in a program, but does not otherwise affect their outcomes. Okay? It's a source of exogenous variation in participation in the program. Those are great if you can find them. And random assignment is, in fact, a special case of instrumental variables. And indeed, it's kind of the ideal instrumental variable because you're sure, because you have assigned it at random, that the only way it's going to affect the outcome is by affecting participation in the program. But sometimes people feel they have found naturally occurring instruments. So there's a famous example in the literature on the returns to college, to four-year university, by David Card, my famous Canadian economist, that used distance to college as an instrument. So the idea was that if parents choose their residential location without an eye towards their children's college opportunities, that at the margin, students who live farther from a college will be less likely to go to college than students that live near a college. And so we can use students' residential location relative to the nearest college in high school as a source of variation in whether or not they attend college. He wrote a paper about that. It's a very well-known and well-cited paper. When I was involved in the evaluation of the British Columbia Labor Market Development Act program back in the late 90s, the nice consulting firm that they hired spent a bunch of time trying to do that with the training centers in BC. So they knew the location of the people in the treated group and the people in their comparison group relative to where the Canada Employment Centers were in BC at the time, and they tried to see if people who lived farther away from a CEC were less likely to participate. That analysis did not go well, it turned out. The results it produced were not plausible. And more generally, this is a particular substantive context, the context of active labor market programs, where it's hard to find compelling sources of exogenous variation like that. So the literature has not, I don't think the analysis in the BC LMDA case even made it into the official report. Maybe it made it into some appendix or footnote. People tend not to use this strategy in this context. A very currently fashionable strategy is called regression discontinuity. What is regression discontinuity? Regression discontinuity is the case where you have a variable, it's called the running variable, that is used to assign individuals to some intervention. All right? So the sort of original paper case in the US was this thing called National Merit Scholars. So there's a test you can take in high school called the PSAT, the Pre-Scholastic Aptitude Test. It is a standardized test. It's supposed to help you practice for the high-stakes SAT that helps determine what university you can get into in the US. But the other thing that goes with PSAT is that the top some number of people who take the test get a scholarship. They become National Merit Scholars. And it's a very simple rule, right? They take all the students who take the test in a year, they arrange them by the order of their score, and then the upper so many become National Merit Scholars. And there's some cutoff score that determines the marginal merit scholar from the marginal not a merit scholar. And the regression discontinuity, so that's the running variable, it's the PSAT score. The idea is that you compare the students just on one side or the other of the boundary that determines who is a merit scholar and who is not. Very clean, right? Because at that level, right, if you're just comparing 100 students on either side in a big country, it's kind of random, right? It's the people who happen to have a good day on the test and the people who happen to have a bad day on the test. And so you compare their outcomes. Did they go to college? Did they finish college? Blah, 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 blah. It's very compelling. Now, it's very local. It's telling you about the impact of getting a National Merit Scholarship if you're a marginal person, which could be different than the impact for inframarginal people in either direction. But it's very causally compelling, right? The assignment mechanism tells you that those people need to be very, very similar on both observed and unobserved characteristics. Could one do this in the context of an active labor market program? So when I was at Michigan, I was involved in a brief attempt to do this in Michigan's program called No Worker Left Behind, which is a play on the US educational program, No Child Left Behind. And it seemed at first that they had implemented sort of a structure that would allow a regression discontinuity estimate in the form of a waiting list. That they had signed up a whole bunch of people for training, they were ordered by the date that they had shown up at the office to sign up, and they were going to train some number, and then there'd be a cutoff date of when you signed up, And we thought, oh, we can compare the people who signed up just in time to get training to the people who signed up just a little bit too late to get training and get this really compelling estimate of training. As we dug deeper into it, and this happens sometimes when you're an excited academic and you've got this idea that the people down at the program have done something that will really help you write a cool paper, once we kind of dug into the weeds of it, they hadn't really done that, that there was a whole lot of slippage, and yeah, anyway, it was bad enough that we had to give up on that whole endeavor. Now, part of the problem with doing RD in the context of active labor market programs relative to educational interventions, where it's often used, is that in educational interventions, you're often like giving a whole class a test or something like that, or rating a whole set of proposals. People have done regression discontinuity using proposal ratings. And you're doing it all at one time. In an active labor market program, typically you have a flow, right? People are kind of coming in dribs and drabs, some this week, some next week. You don't really sort of accumulate them and then assign them scores and then allocate the treatment. You're doing it as a flow exercise in real time. And that makes the RD estimator or strategy harder in the context of active labor market programs than it might otherwise be. So I can't point you to any papers that use this method for active labor market programs, although I could certainly point you to lots of papers that use this method for educational interventions. Strategy number 4. And this is going to turn out to be the strategy that, except for a small number of randomized controlled trials in the US, and a couple now more recently in Scandinavia, this is going to turn out to be what everybody does. And that's part of what makes this literature interesting, I think, is that this is what everybody does. And so I'm going to spend some extra time on this method. And then as part of our discussion of what has happened in Canada, I'm going to talk about how well Canada does at this in particular. So conditional independence, that may be an unfamiliar phrase, even to those who occasionally do empirical work. This is a strategy, this is a technical name for basically selection on observed variables, as it's called in literature. So the idea here is that if we condition on enough stuff, and the right stuff, not just any stuff, not just a large number of variables, but the right variables, that what's left over is random variation in treatment status. Right? So we can condition our way out of the problem of non-random selection into the active labor market program. Now, I've already told you that we can't condition our way out of the problem of non-random selection with just the usual suspect variables, with just education and age and so on. We're going to need other stuff. This is a very strong assumption, right? And not one should take lightly. It is an assumption that is out of favor, I would say, these days, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that as we go forward. But this is a context where sometimes I think it's plausible. I'm going to try to convince you that we can make it more plausible by doing our analyses in specific ways. But it demands rich data, right? You're trying to say that I observe everything that determines whether you get treated or not and your outcome in the absence of treatment. It's a tall order. Right? It's a tall order, but maybe it's sometimes true. How would you tell? All right, so you may have seen on the poster, right, there was a very small subtitle to the talk, 2 cheers for conditional independence. So this is, another talk I give occasionally. This is the first time I've done this particular talk, but there's another talk I've given multiple occasions that's kind of just 2 cheers for conditional independence. So I'm going to do a little bit of that here. There's a notion now out there of something called the hierarchy of evidence. This is prominent in the medical literature in particular, but I think it's also kind of implicit in a lot of economics discussion, although without the term. My friend Arthur Sweetman, who's a McMaster, and I have a paper, my first paper actually, in the Canadian Journal, long after my sojourn at Western Ontario, that discusses this issue, among others, that you might find interesting. So the idea of the hierarchy of evidence is that you can take the different ways to evaluate programs and you can rank them, right? And so the usual thing is randomized controlled trials, and then regression discontinuity, and then instrumental variables, and then conditional independence, and then case studies and theory, which there's probably no theorists here, but the theorists always feel ill-used when I say that. we make a case against that way of thinking, right? And not in the sense that I would not argue with the truth of the proposition that on average, experiments produce more compelling evidence than regression discontinuity designs, which on average produce more compelling evidence than instrumental variables, which on average produce more compelling estimates than conditional dependence. That is not my concern. My concern is that this simplistic hierarchy of evidence ignores the within identification strategy variation, right? It assumes that every experiment is better than every regression discontinuity analysis, is better than every instrumental variables analysis, is better than every conditional dependence analysis. Now, I have tried to think about a way to estimate the fraction of the variance in causal compellingness that is sort of between and within identification strategies. Yeah, wouldn't that be interesting to do? People are smiling like, yeah, you're losing it, Jeff. But I think we can clearly, intuitively know, right? We've all seen failed experiments. We've all seen papers that use instruments that really aren't very plausible to anybody but the author, and maybe not even to them. And I want to sort of convince you that we might also see conditional independence studies that are pretty darn plausible, that where a strong case has been made. And so I worry that with this hierarchy of evidence, to become thinking is really costly. Anybody who's ever taught undergraduates knows thinking is very costly. People don't want to do it. They'll go to great lengths to avoid doing it. And the hierarchy of evidence is a handy alternative to thinking, right? It's like, oh, I don't have to think. I just have to look at the hierarchy and see what's the best I can do. That's what I want to rebel against a little bit. Anyway, so there's a bit of, in a very academic sense, rebellion in this part of the talk. All right, so I want to think about how you might make a case. Suppose you've decided to do a study that relies on conditional independence, that relies on selection on observed variables. How do you make the case that somebody should believe that the resulting estimates are causal? And I want to discuss a variety of ways to do that. There is no clocks. I don't know how I'm doing. Oh, I'm doing all right. So I want to go through a bunch of different ways that you might make a case for a conditional independence paper. Some familiar, some not. Theory, right? Sometimes theory tells you that you got a condition on something, right? So the standard human capital model in labor economics tells you that you got a condition on age, right? Age is going to affect whether or not you decide to take training because it affects the period over which you realize the return to the investment. It also affects outcomes in the absence of training because we know that there's an age earnings profile. Theory doesn't usually fill this all out, unfortunately. Sometimes we'll have existing evidence that there are certain variables that affect both treatment choice and outcomes. We saw from that graph, labor market shocks clearly affect both treatment and outcomes. So we're going to have to do something to condition on labor market shocks if we want conditional independence to be compelling in the active labor market program context. One could have a slide, I was trying to keep it short, about institutional knowledge as well, being helpful in making a case for conditional independence. The two strategies that I think are perhaps less familiar for making a case for conditional independence are stability of the estimates and within study designs. So let me spend a couple more minutes on those than I did on the others. The stability of the estimates looks at, suppose you've decided that I've got a set of 50 conditioning variables that I think maybe suffice for conditional independence. And suppose I break them up into 5 groups of 10. I produce a sequence of estimates, first no conditioning, then first 10 variables, then the first 20, then the first 30, then the first 40, then the whole lot of them. And I look at my estimated average impact of the program for each of those conditioning sets. If I see that the estimated impact settles down as I add more variables, that is suggestive, not definitive, but suggestive evidence that conditional independence has been achieved. All right? So if I think about there being some underlying latent factors, skill, motivation, and all these variables that I'm conditioning on are proxies for those things, then the more proxies I add, the closer I'm going to get to having fully measured the underlying latent thing that I need to condition on. And so the more my estimates are going to settle down. The value of each additional proxy on average is going to be smaller. So the estimates settle down. Now, if there is some factor that is completely unrelated to all of the variables that I have put in, I can still have selection bias. I can still get the wrong answer, right? I have to have proxies and be adding proxies for all of the things that matter for treatment choice and outcomes. But sometimes your data is rich enough that you can kind of argue, well, maybe there is no other unobserved factor. Maybe I'm actually getting closer. There's a couple of details there. That's the point at which this is suggestive. I'm going to skip the other two things in the interest of time to talk about the last thing for making the case for the CIA. And this is one of the things that makes, and I always go, especially when I do this in Europe, actually, usually the first time I say CIA for conditional independence assumption, there will be some giggling, since CIA is also an acronym for something else. But it really helps to make the slide shorter if I use CIA instead of conditional independence. So that's conditional independence assumption. This is a Lalonde study. This is the literature that was spawned by Lalonde's job market paper, is the so-called within study design literature. And the idea is to say, okay, I've got an experiment. Suppose you have an experiment. He did. You have an experiment. Now, I'm going to pretend that I don't have the experiment. So the experiment has a treatment group and a control group that were produced by random assignment of some intervention. Lalonde says, all right, I'm going to cover my eyes and pretend I don't have the experimental control group. And instead, I'm going to go get some non-participants, non-experimental non-participants, or observational, as the statisticians would call it, some non-participants from some other data set, and I'm going to subject them to econometrics, right? So I'm going to take the treatment group from the experiment, the untreated units from some other data sets, the standard non-experimental evaluation approach, right? Especially in the 80s when he was writing, you had administrative data on participants, you had survey data from somewhere on non-participants, you put them together, you hammer them with econometrics, you hope that you get the right answer. So his idea was to combine that with the experiment so that you know the right answer. Then you can say, okay, which of the things that I did non-experimentally got me close to the right answer as revealed by the experiment? That was a clever, really clever idea, right? Really useful idea. It had a very large influence on the literature. So people have done, because there have been a lot of experiments in the US on active labor market programs, there have been a lot of within study design papers in the US on active labor market programs. And as a result, we know a lot about what variables need to be conditioned on in order to get the non-experimental estimate to look like the experimental estimate, right? So one virtue of experiments that I think is undervalued in discussions of whether or not we should do more random assignment evaluations of things is the fact that they have these spillover benefits on knowledge. They tell us something about how to do the non-experimental evaluation better next time. That's pretty important, that kind of knowledge. Now, we can quibble about the extent to which programs from the 80s, programs in different countries, whether that knowledge carries over, right? I'm going to cite some German papers later. Should we generalize findings from Germany to Canada or the US? We could have a chat about that. But I think we should give them at least some weight. So this is just a list of papers. Smith and Todd, that is me, with another friend of mine from grad school, Petra Todd. We reanalyzed, as did Dahish and Waba, reanalyzed the data from Bob's paper to learn yet more stuff from it. I have another paper that just came out in the Journal of Labor Economics this year with a student, Sebastian Kalanico, where we try to recreate part of Bob's data to reanalyze it and learn more. So this has been an incredibly fruitful line of work. One of the things I think this literature offers two very important, if I may really boil it down, substantive conclusions. One is it's really important to condition on past outcomes, right? The sort of labor market outcomes in the period prior to the participation choice. Think about monthly earnings in that graph I showed you, right? That's going to do a pretty good job of capturing the transitory shock as well as the time invariant differences. Conditioning on those is really important. If all you have is demographics, you're going to get it wrong. If you have a lot of past outcomes and demographics, you have some hope of getting it right, especially if you condition flexibly. right? So you let the data speak as to the functional form of the conditioning. Let me talk about 3 particular papers that I think are interesting in this regard. One of them is a paper of mine, Anderson et al. So we take data from a non-experimental data to evaluate JTPA's successor, which is called WIA, or the Workforce Investment Act. And the idea of this paper, and indeed the idea also of the other 2 papers, is we don't have an experiment, but we have data that we think might be good enough to give us the right answer. And then we're going to take some new category of variables and add it to the conditioning set and see if it makes a difference. So in the Anderson et al. Paper, what we did was we got matched data on workers and firms in the US. Right? This is hard data to get. You have to go through the special secret census room and get special sworn status at the Census Bureau, and they interview your friends about whether you're a bad person or not and all this stuff. We did that because we had this idea, which is supported by the literature, that the firms that people work at in the period prior to participation in the program may reveal a bunch of information about them that is not revealed by the other variables. Right? It turns out, a general finding in the literature, better firms have better workers. Right? And so if we know you worked at a better firm, maybe we know you're a better worker, and maybe conditioning on the fact that you worked at a better firm will help us eliminate the problem of non-random selection into the, in this case, the Workforce Investment Act program. The answer that we found, and we were quite surprised by this, is it doesn't move the estimates at all. So nobody else needs to go through all this effort to have their friends interviewed and get these data and blah, 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 because it's not going to move their estimates. That's useful knowledge. That's a useful null finding. Right? The last paper here, Caliendo, Malstedt, and Mitnick, they use the German data. Now, the German data is the standard here in terms of administrative data for program evaluation of active labor market programs. Everything about everybody always. And there are reasons not to like that, but if what you want is to get an unbiased estimate of the impact of a program, you're kind of enthused about having everything about everybody always. And the one thing that, or one of the few things that is not in the German administrative data is information on the big 5 personality traits, right? So the agreeableness and neuroticism and all these things, right? And if you give papers like my paper there, the Anderson et al. Paper, in front of a skeptical seminar audience, one of the variables that they will invariably bring up and say, yeah, sure, you've got these lagged earnings, you've got these demographics, but you don't have any of these soft characteristics of people, like the big 5 traits. And without those, I will not believe your estimates. So it turned out that for 10 or 20,000 people, they actually had big 5 data in Germany. And so they merged it to the admin data. And they did what people usually do with the admin data. And then they repeated the exercise, also conditioning on the big 5 personality traits. 0. Estimates don't move at all. Right? Okay, seminar audience shut down, right? This is another useful null find. Now, these guys, they didn't want to finish the paper, right? I had to like flog them by email to get them to finish the paper because they thought, oh, null finding, nobody will publish it. I said, no, this is a really interesting null finding. And they got published in Labor Economics, so I was right. Lechner and Wunsch have a paper where they take the German data and they basically break it into characteristics, into sort of subsets defined by topics. And they sort of, remove one subset at a time and sort of say, well, which subsets are really important to getting you to the answer that you get with all of the data. So these are not comparisons to experiments, but these are comparisons where you're collecting unusual data on things that sometimes people complain about in seminars that you don't have, and looking to see, right, this is science, right? This is knowledge accumulating, right? It's not just carping in seminars. And they add those variables to the data and see if they make a difference, and they don't. And that's useful, right? That's why you can do, in this context, in the active labor market context, a study based on selection on observed variables and have it be somewhat compelling, is because we have studies like these. And we should do more studies like these, and we should do them in other domains, would be my thought. All right, Canada. So I'm going to give you a very short 2-slide history of the evaluation of these active labor market programs in Canada. Prehistory. not so good. We won't think about that. But it wasn't so good anywhere in those days. We've learned a lot. The positive spin to put on it is we've learned a lot since then. Cycle 1 of these labor market development agreement evaluations, right? So Canada is, in this domain, even more federalist than the US. And so the federal government, they sign these contracts with the provinces and the territories called labor market development agreements that sort of specify a structure, and then the program is administered usually. There were a couple provinces for some periods of time where the program was administered by the feds, voluntarily by the province agreeing to that. But basically, they're signing a contract with the province about how they're going to run the program. And then part of those contracts was that there would be these evaluations, and the province had to pony up data and so on and so forth. The first round of evaluations were contracted out to evaluation consulting firms. Right? So TNS, Goss-Gilroy, da-da-da. There's a whole industry with its own food chain and all this kind of stuff in both the US and Canada. That was the model, right? And the evaluations used a combination of survey and admin data. So one reason I think that they went with the contracting model was that there were firms that had expertise in collecting survey data that the government didn't have. And so oftentimes firms that do surveys will have a little evaluation unit to sort of drum up business for the survey side. And that's what some of these firms had. That's going to be one of the questions we'll talk about is this survey data. The evaluations essentially assume conditional independence, and they're mainly focused on our first question, service versus no service. Cycle 2 of the LMD evaluations featured two very important changes. Excuse me. The first change was that, and I think this is around when they were HRSDC, that they brought the evaluations in-house. So instead of contracting with these private evaluation consulting firms, they had staff internal to the agency undertake the evaluations. That's a big change in the sort of industrial organization of this. The second thing they did was they abandoned the surveys. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons was that it became very clear that you faced an unfortunate choice between spending quite a lot of money on the surveys or having very bad response rates. And so some of the surveys in round 1 had response rates around 50%. Now, in private industry, that's not so bad. In academia, that's viewed as being very low. So the US government has defined kind of a bar for response rates that they want surveys to have. It's 80%, which is well above 50%. When you get down to 50%, you really, really, really worry about non-response bias, right? That the people who respond are systematically different than the people who don't respond. And then on top of that, in an evaluation context, you worry that the treated people who respond are different than the comparison group people who respond, right? That there may be an interaction between non-response and treatment status. There's some evidence that people who receive something feel more grateful and so are more likely to respond. They have a different non-response process than the people who receive nothing. So there were reasons to let go of the surveys, but there were costs to that too that I think we'll spend a minute or two on. Now going forward, I mentioned that I've had some interactions with the folks at ESDC the last couple of weeks. That's been really interesting, and one fellow there sent me kind of their vision for round 3, right? So they're starting a kind of new round of things, and they want to create something called the Active Labor Market Program Data Platform that will be similar in spirit to the German data. So the German agency that is the equivalent of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, I'm not sure what the analog would be in Canada, is called the IAB, which stands for Institut für Arbeitsmarkt und Berufsforschung. It's a good, very long German phrase, which we just usefully. And they have the data set that they give to researchers who want to evaluate their programs is called the Integrated Employment Biographies. And so the dream, and it wasn't clear to me, I think this is more than a dream but less than a reality at the moment, but the more than a dream, less than reality of ESDC is to get something going like that. And they have started but not finished that process. Some questions based on the short history. What is the incremental value of the survey data? Right, it's been given up. What's the cost of that? Question 1B, which is related to that, do the Canadian administrative data have what it takes for conditional independence, based on what we know from the literature that I skimmed over very briefly, but hopefully informatively and enthusiastically? Question 2, the make or buy decision, right? So Canada switched from contracting out these evaluations to firms to doing them in-house. That's a big deal decision. This is something, when I was thinking about what in this would be of interest specifically to political science people, I thought that was one of the aspects of this that might be of interest to people in political science in particular, but economists too. What should governments do in-house versus what should they contract out? Question 3, what evaluation questions to ask? As I mentioned, most of the evaluations so far have focused on service versus no service. Is that what they should be focusing on? And question 4, why not some random assignment in Canada? So on to the questions we go. What can you get out of a survey? Well, the surveys can give you really neato, wonderful data on conditioning variables that most administrative data sets anywhere, and certainly the Canadian and US administrative data sets, do not contain. Test scores, right? Canadians not as enthusiastic about test scores as Americans, and that's fine. But whatever you think about them in some broad sense, conditioning on them in this kind of study can be very compelling because they have a lot of information bundled up in them. Some work I did in the UK, my friend Peter Dolton, suggests that attitudinal variables can actually be useful to condition on in this context. Admin data don't have attitudinal variables. How do you feel about work? How do you feel about mothers staying home with their kids? Variables like that. In this particular British program that we were looking at, which was for single moms, or lone moms as they call them in the UK, those attitudinal variables move the estimates a fair amount, seem to be picking up a fair amount of non-random selection. The admin data in Canada mostly comes in calendar year chunks, right? It's tax data, the admin data on labor market outcomes. One might want, for this purpose, more temporally detailed data, right? Think back to that graph and think what it would look like if I'd aggregated it into calendar years, right? A lot of nuance would have been lost from that graph, and a lot of nuance will be lost from the conditioning if you are aggregating the individual histories into calendar year chunks. Surveys can allow you, with some measurement error to be sure, to pick up monthly histories and possibly to distinguish between zero earnings because you're out of the labor force and zero earnings because you're unemployed. And there's some work that I did with the JTPA data that suggests that that distinction may be important in the conditioning. You can collect information on people's families, right? Their parental education, parental occupation. You can collect good data on education. Back in that very first consulting meeting in Ottawa about the SOMs in 1996, one of the problems that came up with was that the caseworkers in the provinces who run the programs don't always feel a need to fill in the years of schooling field in the admin data. And in fact, it is missing for quite a large fraction of people. Well, putting aside, you would like to condition very finely on education. You'd like to have credentials that people have gotten from two-year colleges and so on. If you don't even have years of schooling, it's going to be hard to tell a causal story here. Now, in that thing that I told you about, the ALM program data platform, they intend to make the provinces fill in the schooling variables. I was very happy about that, so 21 years later. Another thing that surveys can do is that they can give you data on additional outcomes. And as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, we know more about impacts on earnings than we do about impacts on health or other family members or crime. Crime has been found to be important in some US programs, probably less of an issue in Canada. But for a full cost-benefit accounting, you'd like to have those other outcomes, and they're often not there in the admin data. Most admin data in most countries don't allow you to link family members together, for example. So there's things you could get from a survey, right? There's a cost there to giving those up. Do the Canadian admin data have what it takes? Time to stop soon. So I foreshadowed a lot of this, right? The calendar year aggregation for the labor market outcomes concerns me for two reasons. First of all, you're losing a lot of nuance, and some of the existing literature using US data suggests that this sort of monthly variation could be important in the conditioning. The second thing is you raise alignment problems for yourself. If a person participates in a program in June of 1998, is 1998 the first program year, or is it the last pre-program year, or is it some other thing that we should just leave out? We know from the US evaluations of the CETA program, which is the predecessor to JDPA, that those alignment issues can be very important in what answer you get. So that concerns me. I've already told you that the admin data, they're weak on things other than labor market outcomes. So you have sort of EI participation, you have past participation in government programs, you have earnings. You don't have much on demographics. You don't have a lot on skills. So it's not the German data, but I don't know. I've been debating, would I give it a B+? I think I might give it a B+. Which is a lot better than it used to be. And the plans that they have would take it up to an A. Make or buy. There's an old paper by Craig Riddell on this issue, and there's not a lot of other literature that I have found. Making is nice because you have full control. You don't have to let the data out. You build up expertise within the agency, and that's good, and they have done that at ESDC. They now have a small set, but a set of people who are pretty good at applying this sort of cutting-edge frontier methods of econometrically evaluating active labor market programs using administrative data. It is a puzzle to me that those people have not all left for analysis group. The skills they have that the government now has basically paid them to acquire are very valuable in the private market. It's good for Canada that those people are still there, but I worry about this as an ongoing equilibrium, given the differential between what you can get for those skills in the government and what you can get for those skills outside. Another thing I worry about in this context of make or buy, and this is a bit independent of whether you contract out or not, is the ability of somebody to replicate the research. Right? That's that science thing again. I talk about replication. At the moment, the equilibrium is that the data don't easily go outside the government, and so you'd have to take the government's word on it. I might be happier doing that in Canada than in some other countries, but still, independent replication is always a nice thing. Now, there is talk with that platform that it will be available to sort of bona fide researchers who want to replicate and extend government evaluations, but it's not there yet. I worry about that. There is a claim, there's a published paper in the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluation that came out in the fall that sort of summarizes the whole recent experience of the active labor market policy evaluations, and they claim very large cost savings from switching from the contractors to doing it in-house. They seemed implausibly large to me, but you know, there's only so much you can poke by email. But that's a plus, right? If it's real, it's a plus. There is still some cost. They still hire people outside to peer review the stuff, which is good. And they occasionally will have input earlier in the design stage, and that's good. But they argue that they have gone from spending $1 million a year on contractors to spending $70,000 a year on contractors without spending any more on government personnel. Which question? I'm going to just leave that there for you to ponder. Which evaluation questions to ask? So this is a resolution, and we're 2 slides from the end, I think, that has been hard for me to come to, but I think is a reasonable one. These programs are always going to be there. If these programs are always going to be there, how much sense does it make to spend all our time evaluating program versus no program, since we're not going to, no matter how badly that does, we're not going to kill the program? Should we instead devote our evaluative attention to issues about how to run and organize the program better, right? And there's been a little bit of that. There's a study in Canada they did about the timing of sort of initial contact with the Canada Employment Centers. There's a lot more you can do, and some of it's been done in European context, a little bit has been done in the US. I would have the sort of ship of state, turn its direction a little bit and focus its energies less on service versus no service and more on, we've got these programs, we're not going to get rid of them, but there's thoughts out there about how to organize them differently and perhaps better. Let's focus our attention on what should the caseworkers do? Caseworkers are expensive. What can we do with sort of big data stuff to predict maybe who we should treat early and who we should treat late? There's a bunch of stuff out there that I think might have a higher payoff at this point than what has been done. Why no RCTs? One of the things that the Canadian labor economics community does, part of its charm, is it nags ESDC to do experiments, so far unsuccessfully. With the exception, now there have been experiments in other domains. It's not that no experiments happen in Canada. There was a social existence experiment in British Columbia. There was the Self-Sufficiency Project, which was an amazing, wonderful experiment, source of data. We learned a huge amount from that. There was a negative income tax experiment in Canada, it turns out, called the MINCOM experiment. Particularly in a context where you've taken my advice and gotten away from doing service versus no service, right? The usual objection you get from government folks to doing random assignment is to say, well, we're obliged to serve everybody. Well, if the evaluation is not about service versus no service, but is about how often you see the caseworker or how much power the caseworker has or whatever, that objection goes away. So experiments have their issues, and indeed, I am probably one of the people who's written most about that, but they produce very compelling exogenous variation, and I think they're being underutilized in this domain in Canada. Conclusions. So thank you for your patience and persistence here. The world of active labor programs is not short on acronyms. We have learned that today for sure. I guess that's true of many practical literatures. Better data helps a lot, right? And one of the things that I really like about this literature, one of the things that attracted me to working with Heckman at the beginning of the day, and I originally started a dissertation with Gary Becker. I know there's at least one Becker student in the room. And I switched to Heckman, and part of it was this interest of his and mine in sort of applied epistemology, right? Sort of how do we learn stuff from data? And I think this literature illustrates that really well, partly because we have these experiments, that we have in fact learned a lot from data, and we have learned a lot about what data you need to have to learn about the impacts of programs. And that's kind of cool. The literature has made a lot of progress. Canada has made a lot of progress. I mean, I went to Chicago, so it's not always something I do to get up and praise government agencies. But I do think you have to give ESRC some credit that, I went back and looked at my talk in front of the deputy minister in 2006, and a lot of the stuff that I crabbed about has been done or is on their agenda for the next round. And, I don't think that was any fault of mine, but it's still, that's kind of nice. So I will stop there, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thanks very much, Jeff. So we have about 10 minutes or so that we can take questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question, we don't have another microphone, I don't think, so you have to speak loudly. But oh, we have a microphone. So does anybody have any questions?
Thank you for an excellent presentation, Jeff. I'm just wondering if you have any insight into the other areas of policy in terms of if there's any other areas of policy in Canada that are this advanced or which ones maybe we need to think a little bit more about doing things and moving ahead like we did in the ALMP area.
My sense is that this is kind of a pathfinder, as the British would say. That this literature, in part because of the willingness to do experiments and that's the access to experimental data with reasonably large sample sizes, that a lot of methodological energy has been focused here, not because this policy domain is super duper important. It's not, right? In the US, it's a very tiny fraction of the budget. In Canada, it's a bit more. This isn't CPP or Social Security or any of these things that are eating double-digit fractions of budgets. This is a little tiny thing, but because it's sort of looking where the light is, in a sense, right? This policy domain is easier to study because of the availability of data at the individual level and because of nice sources of variation, and so that's where we go. I've been on dissertation. I had never counted before, by the way. Is it really 97? Wow. All right, I'll have to celebrate my 100th student or something. Give them a door prize. I've been on committees of a lot of public finance students at Chicago or at Michigan. People doing other things, health stuff. Health is reasonably good too. I think again because the data quality is pretty high. But like public finance is a couple of decades behind this literature in terms of methodological stuff, I would say. Now, I don't know that specifically about Canada, but I think these things are pretty correlated spatially. So I think there's a lot of room to be, there's a lot of kind of intellectual arbitrage that researchers could do. I know there's some students in the room, by sort of importing methodological insights from this literature into domains, whether it's urban economics or public finance or whatever, that are a bit behind.
Thanks very much. If you were advising the deputy ministers, Canadian deputy ministers today, what would your advice be as to the area that's most promising, the evaluation that would be most promising in terms of variation of service? And are there existing provincially based programs, for example, that you would want to build that on? I'm just interested what your contemporary advice would be to them.
Well, some of it was in the penultimate. Oop. Where'd they go? I guess some of it is this, right? To turn the focus a bit away of the question. In terms of interventions, one thing that is striking in most countries is that the fraction, people take a classroom training and occupational skills kind of program in a particular thing, welding, whatever it is. The fraction of people who end up actually using that particular narrowly defined skill 2 years later is surprisingly small. I don't think we completely understand why that is, but in a sense, there's a lot of wasted effort happening, right? If you spend 3 months training somebody to be a welder and they never weld, or they weld for a few months and then they stop and do something else, they could have spent that 3 months doing something else. That's a big opportunity cost, and there's a direct cost of supplying that training service. And so improving sort of information in two senses, I think is important here, right? And this is one of these is perennial in this literature. Trying to focus the training on stuff that's actually in demand, right? A lot of there's complaints across many countries and many time periods that oftentimes the provision of occupational training is supply-driven rather than demand-driven, right? We have a school, it has a welding classroom, so we teach people welding, whether or not we actually have any idea that there's a big demand for new welders out there in the world. That's an institutional thing, but it's also a research thing. The second thing I think we don't do very well is help people understand what occupations are like before they undertake the training, right? So that, because I think a lot of that attrition, right, a lot of the people who are trained to weld and then don't end up welding is because actually after they weld for a little while, they realize they don't like it. And this is a broader issue in sort of post-secondary too, which is also an area that I write in. That, I think a lot of the reason why people drop out of university is that they discover that they don't like university. And, I was always, grade 13 went away a couple of years after I left Western Ontario, and there was a lot of discussion of it around that time. And it seemed like one thing that grade 13 could have done but did not do was sort of give people a taste of what university was like on the cheap, so that then they would not go to university, which is expensive, and drop out. And we know in the US and Canada that a lot of the labor market mojo that comes from university comes with finishing, right? There is some benefit to just taking classes and not finishing, but most of the mojo comes with finishing. And so if you can find a way so that most people either finish or don't start, you're in a better place. And I think the same thing is true with these labor market programs, and there's lots of dropout from those too, which is a related issue. But if you can find a way to help people kind of ex ante sort out what's going to be a good match for them before they actually go take the training, that would be a good thing to do. And I think that's a tall order, but it would be sure useful if we could do it. There was a hand back here too.
I've got a bit more of a technical econometrics question, and I was just, given the data that we've got and sort of the controls that we have access to with the sort of yearly Canadian labor data that we have, I was wondering if you had looked into any of the sort of more advanced machine learning classification algorithms as a way to develop a sort of random treatment assignment instrument. And I was just wondering if if you had looked at that, because this was just sort of an idea that I had that I thought might be good, but at the same time it might be not feasible for reasons I have yet to understand. But just in terms of establishing an independent instrument variable, can we use likelihood of classification into one or the other and sort of layered regression analysis that way as a way to sort of get out an independent instrument while also having separate conditional variables?
I heard a couple things in there, so let
Yeah,
me make a couple
there
remarks,
was
and
a-
we'll see if they
Yeah.
answer your question. I was just, I don't know if you counted the people at other universities whose committees I served on, but I was just on the external reviewer for a guy called Michael Knaus, who is being trained by Michael Lechner at St. Gallen, and they have a joint paper that does part of what you described, right? So they're both, Michael Lechner is very interested in machine learning stuff, and we had this very lively discussion about how econometrics is all going to go out the window and be changed by big data and blah, 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 perhaps. But anyway, he and his student have a paper where they sort of take I think they're using the Swiss data, the Swiss administrative data, and are using machine learning tools to choose the conditioning set for a non-experimental evaluation of active labor market programs in Switzerland. And you can find that on the IZA German Institute working paper page. A second thing I heard you talk about was a different but related thing, which is to use a statistical treatment rule to assign people to services based on predictions of their impacts. And the SOMS, the thing that I consulted on in 1996, was attempting to do that. So they wanted to estimate a great big giant linear regression using the admin data where they interacted participant characteristics with all the different kinds of service, and then they were going to use this big giant estimated regression to predict a person-specific or really a subgroup-specific impact for each service. And then the caseworker would be presented with this information. So the would-be participant would come in, the caseworker types in information on their characteristics, they're put into the model, out spews these predictions of impacts from each service, and then the caseworker can say, our sophisticated model, the service outcome measurement system, predicts that you should best take this course, right? That fell apart for two reasons. One is the caseworkers realized that it might cost them their jobs, and they have ways to make things not happen. And there was apparently a demonstration at some point somewhere in the prairies where they did a live demonstration of this, where they typed in somebody's characteristics in front of this big pool of caseworkers in like Saskatchewan, and it said, oh, the person should be trained to fish. And there was a lack of face validity to this prediction that I guess was legendary. Having said all that, that was a long time ago in terms of big data stuff. That idea still floats around in this literature. Michael Lechner and I have a paper called What is the Value Added of Caseworkers, where we estimate such a model using the Swiss data, and we look at the labor market outcomes you would get if you assigned everybody to their most effective service as we estimate it, and we compare that to what you get when the caseworkers assign them, and our algorithm does a lot better. The caseworkers do about as well as assigning people at random, according to our estimates.
I'd like to go back to your welder course case for a minute. It seems to me the welding training might have two effects. Number one, it trains a person to be a good welder. The other thing it may do is to measure a person's ability to stick with a training program, particularly if there's some reputation that welding is a rigorous program, stick with it and complete it. And so there might be positive labor market outcomes for people who complete the welding program, even if they do things quite unrelated to welding, because now employers can look at this as a measure of their kind of general employability. In economics, we often feel as if half of what we're doing is training our students in economics, and half of what we're doing is measuring their ability to do a program that we feel is rigorous. We give grades, we write letters of recommendation. And so I wonder if you have while clearly if we could identify exactly the right thing to train them in, that would be good. Is there some value in training programs even if the match isn't very good?
I'm almost certainly there is. I would say in response to that, that then if that's what you think you're getting mostly is this sort of signal of, and of course there's this whole literature out there about is higher education a signal versus is it really increasing people's human capital and all that stuff. You know, there's cheaper ways to demonstrate persistence than welding courses because welding courses take a lot of physical capital that's expensive. You know, maybe we should have really boring lectures that are cheap to deliver and see if people will sit through 100 of those, and then they've demonstrated persistence. I will. We won't say that's what economics is. They're back here.
Oh, thank you very much. Just a quick question on the CIA assumption, right? The conditional independence assumption. Is that also synonymous with saying we maybe have to give more credence to the sort of old-fashioned, traditional, cross-sectional data set that might be rich in all of these potential variables, even a survey that asks a lot of retrospective questions that then gets you this past information? Because if so, there's probably then a lot of old data sets that might have had these sorts of questions sitting there that could be reclaimed and perhaps you know, advance our knowledge. I'm thinking of general social surveys that were tended to be used by more sociologists and psychologists, and I'm just getting your thoughts on that availability potential of sort of rich conditioning right-hand side variables and their use.
I think my answer to your question is yes. That sounds like a very worthy thing to do. And, you know, we've learned a lot, too, about how to flexibly condition on things and how to select variables and stuff like that since a lot of earlier studies were done. I don't want to, by no means do I want to defend every selection on observed variable study. There's lots of very non-compelling ones out there. What I want to do is argue that there are tools that you can use to try to get a handle on what variables you need to have to make conditional independence assumption compelling, and then you can write a paper that embodies that case. This is one of the things that I really harp on with those 97 PhD students is make the case, right? Justify, don't announce. There's a lot of economics papers where people just announce, I assume this, I do that, and they never make a case, right? It seems to me like that's our value added, is the case. So there's an even a meta point even above the other meta points, which is make the case. And part of why I like giving this lecture on 2 cheers for conditional independence is because it's a lecture about making a case.
I'm going to steal one more question. You had mentioned that there was no way the programs were going to go despite the evidence that they don't work. That raises a big question about what it is that we do and why, and does anybody care? I just thought maybe you could, in the 1 minute, answer whether that's too harsh of an interpretation.
Well, part of my answer is I think, as I said, we should start looking at other questions. Partly that was a bit too strong. The you know, the programs will never go away, but they're remarkably persistent. But part of what we're doing in this literature is we're learning how to evaluate things, right? This literature has this big methodological component. And so even if these active labor market programs are not going to go away, because we have the opportunity to do methodological studies here, like the within study designs and so on, I think there's still value in that sense.
What does it say about the policy process?
That's a question for the political scientists. So maybe we can all buzz about that afterwards, yes.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. And I just want to have everyone join me in thanking you once again for your lecture today. And thanks, everyone, for coming.